Right now, somewhere in your life, a woman's hands are telling you something you were never taught to read. Maybe it happened last week. Maybe it happened an hour ago, in a kitchen, at a table, across a bar, and you walked right past it without knowing what you had just seen. This is not about her words. Her words are careful. They are chosen, filtered, sometimes even rehearsed, because women learn early that words carry consequences. Her hands do not carry the same weight of caution. They move before she decides to let them move, and that is exactly why most men never think to look there. You have been trained, without realizing it, to wait for permission that speaks in sentences. So when the real signal arrives quietly, through motion instead of language, it slips by unnoticed. Here's the question I want you to sit with for the rest of this video. What is she actually telling you with her hands right now, in this exact moment, that you are too distracted to notice? By the end of this video, you will know exactly how to answer that question, and you will never watch a woman's hands the same way again. Her face can lie to you. Her hands almost never do. Think about the last time you tried to guess whether someone was interested in you by studying their smile. It is a natural place to look, but it is also the least reliable place, because the face is the part of the body people are most practiced at controlling. From childhood, most of us learn to manage our expressions in front of others. The hands never received that same training. When a woman feels a flicker of attraction or nervousness or genuine interest, her hands often respond before her conscious mind has caught up with the feeling itself. This is what psychologists sometimes call a leakage cue, a small physical signal that leaks out despite a person's attempt to appear composed. It is not deliberate. It is not performed for your benefit. That is precisely what makes it valuable. Picture her sitting across from you at a table, or standing near you at a counter, hands resting somewhere within your view. You are focused on her eyes, her tone, the rhythm of the conversation. Meanwhile, her hands are quietly running a separate conversation of their own, one that has nothing to do with the words leaving her mouth. Of course, this does not mean every movement carries meaning. Sometimes a hand simply adjusts, shifts, rests. Context always matters here, and a single gesture on its own rarely proves anything at all. But there is a difference between random movement and responsive movement, and once you learn to tell them apart, you will never unsee it. You might be thinking that people fidget for all kinds of reasons that have nothing to do with attraction, nerves, boredom, habit. Sometimes that is exactly true. That is why what matters is not one isolated movement, but the pattern that forms, and who that pattern seems aimed at. This raises an obvious question, one that has very little to do with her and everything to do with how you were raised to pay attention. If hands are this honest, why do so many men still miss what they are saying entirely? It's not that you're bad at this, it's that no one ever showed you where to look. From an early age, most men are taught to communicate through direct statements. You ask a question, you expect an answer. You make a move, you expect a response. This works well in business, in negotiation, in almost every practical corner of life where clarity is the goal. But attraction does not follow that same structure, especially for women who are frequently discouraged from being too direct about interest in the first place. This creates a strange mismatch. She may be signaling clearly in her own language, while you are still waiting for a sentence that confirms what you already sense but cannot name. Researchers who study nonverbal communication have long noted that a significant portion of emotional meaning is carried through the body rather than through speech. In plain terms, that means the truest parts of a conversation are often happening below the words, in gesture, posture, and touch, while the words themselves are doing something closer to filling space. There is also a second reason you miss it, and this one is more personal. When you are attracted to someone, your own nervous system narrows your focus. You concentrate on what to say next, on not saying the wrong thing, on managing your own composure. That mental effort pulls your attention inward, toward yourself, at the exact moment her hands are offering information outward, toward you. Attention inward, signal outward. Two things happening in opposite directions at the same time, and most men only ever notice the one happening inside their own head. Think back to a conversation that once seemed ordinary, one where you walked away replaying your own words, wondering if you said the right thing, without ever pausing to consider what her body had been doing the entire time you were talking. That is not a failure of intelligence. It is simply where your focus was pointed. There is also a common mistake worth naming here because it shapes almost everything that follows. Many men wait for a moment of total certainty before they act, some unmistakable, unambiguous sign that removes all doubt. But that kind of certainty rarely exists in early attraction. What exists instead is a pattern of small physical cues that accumulate over time, and waiting for perfect clarity often means waiting past the window when those cues were actually meaningful. Once you understand why you have been looking in the wrong place, you are ready to see the first specific signal, and it is smaller than you would expect. Watch her wrist before you watch her eyes. It sounds like a strange instruction, almost too small to matter, but the inner wrist happens to be one of the more revealing areas of the body when it comes to comfort and openness. This is an area with thin skin, close to major blood vessels, and it is rarely exposed casually in public settings. When a woman turns her wrist upward or leaves it resting open and visible near you, rather than closed and guarded, it often reflects a body that has relaxed its defenses, even if only slightly, even if she herself has not consciously noticed the shift. This connects to something researchers describe as self-soothing behavior, which simply means the small physical actions people use to manage internal arousal, whether that arousal comes from nervousness, excitement, or attraction itself. In plain terms, the body finds small ways to regulate a feeling building faster than the mind can process it. Touching the hair, tracing a finger along the collarbone, these are not random habits. They are the body quietly working to stay composed while something stirs beneath the surface. Picture this scene. She reaches up and tucks a strand of hair behind her ear, not once, but 2 or 3 times across a short conversation, each time slightly slower than the last, each time lingering a beat longer near her neck before her hand drops away. That lingering matters. A single quick touch might mean nothing at all. A touch that slows down, that seems almost unaware of itself, tends to mean something different entirely. Of course, this does not mean every open wrist or hair touch is a green light. Some people simply have longer hair that needs adjusting, and some are naturally more expressive with their hands, regardless of who they are speaking to. Context always matters, which is where her baseline becomes important. If she treats everyone this way, it may be personality rather than signal. But if it appears specifically in your presence and shifts with how close you are standing, that specificity turns a small gesture into real information. The most common mistake at this stage is treating one of these signals as the finish line, as though noticing it means the work is done. It is not the finish line. It is an invitation to keep paying attention, because these early signals tell you she is open, not that she is certain, and not that the moment has fully arrived. Remember what I told you at the start of this video? That there was one signal most men not only miss, but actively misread? We are getting closer to it now, but we are not there yet, because there is a layer that comes before it, one that most men skip past entirely because it feels too subtle to matter. There is another detail worth mentioning here, one most explanations skip over completely. Timing changes the meaning of a gesture almost as much as the gesture itself. A hair touch at the very start of a conversation, before any real rapport has formed, usually means little. The same gesture after several minutes of genuine, engaged conversation, after laughter, after her posture has already turned toward you, carries a different weight entirely. Same hand, same motion, different sentence. Watching a single gesture in isolation will almost always mislead you. What you are actually building, gesture by gesture, is a timeline. These early signals tell you she's open. But there is a second, quieter set of movements that tell you she is actually ready, and almost no one talks about them. There is a moment when her hands stop belonging only to her and start responding to you. This is one of the more fascinating parts of nonverbal attraction, and it rarely gets talked about because it happens quickly and quietly, often in the middle of an ordinary exchange. Psychologists call this behavioral mirroring, the unconscious tendency to match the posture, rhythm, or movement of someone we feel connected to. In plain language, it means her body begins to move in sync with yours, without either of you deciding that it should. You reach for your glass, and a moment later, without thinking about it, she reaches for hers. You lean slightly forward to hear her better, and her own posture shifts to close a little of that same distance. None of this is choreographed. None of it is calculated. It happens below conscious awareness, in the same part of the brain responsible for empathy and connection, which is exactly why it feels so different from a deliberate gesture. It feels involuntary because it is. There is a related pattern worth understanding here too, something a little more specific than general mirroring. Watch what happens with objects near you both: a napkin, a phone, a glass, a menu. When a woman begins to touch, adjust, or linger near something that belongs to you, or that sits closer to your side of the space than hers, she is often extending her attention outward, toward your territory, in a way that reflects comfort with closing distance rather than maintaining it. Imagine sitting across a small cafe table. At first, her hands stay close to her own cup, entirely her own space. As the conversation deepens, her fingers drift slightly toward the center of the table, toward a shared sugar packet, toward the edge of a menu between you both, lingering a moment longer than function requires. That drift toward the middle is rarely accidental once real rapport has formed. Before we go further, there is one additional layer to this that most explanations completely skip over. Mirroring and proximity only mean something when they escalate over time, rather than simply existing once and staying static. A single instance of matched posture might be coincidence. A pattern that deepens, that closes distance gradually across the length of a conversation, is a different story altogether, and it tends to build towards something specific. You might wonder whether you could simply be imagining this, seeing connection where there is only ordinary politeness. That is a fair concern, and it is worth taking seriously. The distinction lies in direction. Politeness tends to stay level, consistent, unchanging throughout an interaction. Genuine escalation moves in one direction only, gradually closer, gradually more synchronized, rarely reversing itself once it has properly begun. This is what we call the escalation window, the stretch of time where her body is actively inviting closeness, whether or not she would ever say so directly in words. Most men either miss this window entirely, distracted by their own nerves, or they notice it far too late, once the moment has already begun to fade on its own. The most common mistake here deserves its own moment, because it is the one that costs the most. It is treating mirroring and proximity as confirmation that she will make the next move herself. She will not in most cases, because the entire pattern we have been describing is the body speaking a language that stops short of an explicit invitation. Her hands can close the distance on the table. They rarely close the distance between two mouths. That part still requires you. Initiating openly carries social risk for a woman in a way it often does not for a man, and most women have learned, whether consciously or not, to communicate readiness through proximity rather than direct action. Her hands moving toward the center of the table are not an accident. They are the closest thing to an invitation this moment is going to offer. Understanding the window is one thing, but there is a final signal, the most overlooked one of all, that tells you the window is about to close for good. The moment her hands go still is the moment most men look away, and it is the exact moment they should move. Everything we have discussed so far has been about motion, mirroring, drifting, reaching, adjusting. But the final signal, the one almost every man misreads, is the opposite of motion entirely. It is stillness. Specifically, it is the stillness that follows a period of noticeable movement, when hands that have been busy, active, engaged, suddenly go quiet. Behavioral researchers who study attention and arousal have observed that stillness in the body often signals focus rather than disinterest, a kind of physical concentration that occurs when a person's attention has narrowed sharply onto one thing. In plain terms, when a woman's hands go quiet after a period of fidgeting or mirroring, it frequently means her attention has locked onto the present moment, onto you, rather than drifting elsewhere. It is not boredom settling in, it is focus arriving. Picture it clearly. Her hands, which have been moving throughout the conversation, adjusting a glass, touching her hair, drifting toward the table's center, suddenly rest. Perhaps they settle near yours, close enough that the distance feels charged rather than casual. Perhaps they simply stop moving altogether, resting quietly in her lap or on the table, while her eyes hold steady on yours a beat longer than before. That stillness is not the end of interest. It is the peak of it. Of course, Stillness alone, stripped of everything that came before it, would mean very little. A woman sitting still because she is tired or distracted by something else entirely looks nothing like this. What we are describing is stillness that arrives after an escalating pattern, stillness that follows closeness rather than replacing it, stillness that comes paired with steady eye contact rather than a gaze that has wandered elsewhere. This is where most men make their final, most costly mistake. They interpret the quiet as a cooling off, a signal to pull back, to give her space, to wait for something more obvious. But you now understand that quiet, in this specific context, is often the loudest thing she has communicated all evening. Waiting past it, hoping for a clearer sign, is frequently the exact moment the window quietly closes. You might be wondering why a moment like this feels so easy to misread. The answer has less to do with her and more to do with the story most men have been told, that clarity should feel loud and unmistakable, announced rather than felt. Real moments rarely announce themselves that way. There is one more qualification worth naming before we close this out. None of this replaces basic respect or genuine attentiveness to how she is actually feeling in that specific moment. This is not a formula to apply blindly, regardless of context. It is a way of finally noticing what has likely been in front of you all along, so that when the moment does arrive, you are no longer the last one in the room to recognize it. Now you can see the full sequence, from the earliest self-soothing gesture to the mirroring that follows, all the way to the stillness that marks its peak. There is only one thing left: knowing what to do with it. Everything we have walked through tonight fits together into a single unfolding pattern. It begins quietly, with a wrist turned open, a strand of hair tucked back a little too slowly. It grows through mirroring, through hands drifting toward the space between you, through small unconscious echoes of your own movements. And it peaks, not in more motion, but in stillness, the quiet that most men mistake for an ending when it is actually an arrival. The overarching truth underneath all of it is simple, even if the details are not. A woman's hands rarely lie, and they are almost always saying more than her words allow her to say directly. Once you know how to watch for that, you stop guessing, and you start seeing. You do not need to overanalyze every gesture from here forward, turning every small movement into a puzzle to solve. That was never the goal. The goal was simply to close the gap between what is actually happening and what you have been trained to notice, so that when a real moment arrives, you recognize it as it happens rather than a week later. I want to ask you something before you go. Think back to a moment you may have missed this. What did her hands do right before you hesitated? I read every comment on this channel, and I would genuinely like to know what you remember once you look back with this in mind. If this kind of insight into how women actually communicate feels valuable to you, this channel exists to keep giving you more of it, one honest signal at a time.